Well, hi, and welcome back to Risk Management. It's my delight to welcome Matt Whaley from Ernst & Young back here today, my co-author. We'll be chatting about chapters 2 and 3 potentially in our books today. We'll see how far we get. Matt, thanks for being back on the program.
Pleasure, Chris.
Yeah. Exciting times. We've just published the book and it's out in press. And for those of you who want to pick up a copy, you can and follow along at home now with chapters 2 and 3 that we'll be talking about. Matt, chapter 2 is really dealing a large part in issues of corporate governance and boardroom decisions and so forth. And we divide this chapter up into sort of 3 segments, one being sort of talking about how you do value-based corporate governance, the second being getting the boardroom basics right, and the third being impacts of the corporate governance and how to measure those. Could you talk a little bit about those, and then maybe we'll delve into each one of them in more detail?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, lost you for a minute then. The chapter, starts off with corporate governance. It's basically about legal risk management at a big picture level, right? So within are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Cool. Sorry, you were so still.
No, it's just a little bit of technological skill. I'm here.
Right. So big picture. It's about it at a big picture level. So organizations naturally manage legal risk. It's what they don't. Very few organizations set out with strategies to breach law and regulation. They want to operate within the remit of the law because they're good citizens and because they understand that if they begin to break the law, then they'll get found out for that, and that can result in this sort of significant fines, reputational damage that we talked about last week. The book really, the chapter really starts with what. Sorry, just go back a little bit again. That governance starts at the boardroom. So the way that the board interacts, the importance of a good level of challenge of decision making, having the right skills within the boardroom to actually run and manage a company, they're incredibly important from a legal risk perspective because they make sure that the organization is being pointed and managed in a way that is going to minimize the likelihood of them breaching any form of law or regulation, and certainly minimise the likelihood of that happening on a massive scale. Now, there's been a lot of work. So post-crisis, post the financial crisis, post 2008, there was a bit of work done around looking at some of the organisations that failed during that crisis, and there are a couple of reviews that went into the corporate governance. So they basically found that it was the decision making at board level that seemed to make a difference, or the governance and oversight from board level that seemed to make a difference as to whether organizations succeeded or failed. There was very little difference in terms of the book of business, the client base between one bank that might fail and one bank that might succeed. The difference seemed to be in the culture, the way that they operated, and the governance, and that's set from board level. So the way that boards run themselves, the way they're structured, became very important. There were 2 reviews that were discussed in the chapter: the Walker Review and the Kay Review. And forgive me, but I can't remember which one came first. And they basically reiterate this fact: look, that corporate governance is incredibly important. That there needs to be a good level of challenge within the boardroom so that you don't get groupthink and people just, boards going along with a powerful personality. And that they have a good level of oversight into the businesses that they run. So it's all very well setting a tone from the top, and I think we talked about this a bit last week, but you need to be able to hear the echo from the bottom. And in order to hear that echo, you need to be in touch with what's happening at the front line of your business, at the customer facing staff, at the deal making staff, at the sales staff, or the buying staff, at that front line. And that's a bit that's missing, I think. Having that, there's a lot of data captured about activity, what happens at the front line, and there's good tone from the top in a lot of businesses, and evidence of good challenge and the right committees being set up, the mix of independent directors versus executives with a management responsibility within the company. You can set all of that up, and that's all set out. It's quite structured and set out in corporate governance rules. But helping the board to get information from the front line is what's really important. So if you think about that tone from the top and the echo from the bottom, there's a big gap in the middle, where you expect that information to be filtered up, and the message from the top to be filtered down. And it's that bit in the middle that, to my mind, needs the most work, to make sure that what is being set, the policy statements that are being set at board level, are being interpreted into action, that being interpreted into procedures that will be put into action by people at the front line, and that there's a feedback loop from people at the front line that says, okay, this is what we're doing, this is the net results, how does that compare against what you want us to be doing from a policy perspective, from a culture and a value perspective?
So that's interesting. This triggers, as we're talking about this, a thought about that sort of corporate governance structure and those cycles of return. That I like the analogy of the echo, and it comes back around and reverberates, almost like a radar, where the sound goes out and then comes back.
Yeah.
And there's a great book by a guy named Robert Axelrod called The Evolution of Cooperation. We haven't talked about it before, but it just brought to mind what you were saying. And Axelrod did a lot of work on sort of behavioral psychology. And one of the things he found was that during World War I, there was horrific trench warfare going on between the British and the French and the Germans. And during the war, the sides would shell each other and try to blow up each other's trenches. Well, nobody in the trenches themselves actually wanted to die. So the commanding generals would say, sort of fire into that trench. But what the opposing sides figured out how to do was to send warning shots over the trenches intentionally to miss. And then they would move to the side, and then they'd shell that trench so that the higher ups would say, yes, we're doing this. And then they'd move back. So both sides were essentially trying to preserve themselves. Eventually, the higher ups caught on to this. And so one of the things that they figured out to do to sort of overcome this and to achieve their goals was to rotate the troops through frequently so they could never establish these patterns. And so you'd have disruption. And we talk a little bit in our book about short-termerism and this concept that if I rotate people through quickly, perhaps even at the executive level, or it doesn't even have to be executive, it could be at the lower levels, that is going to disrupt this feedback process that you're describing, isn't it?
It would. Well, in a way it would, because you wouldn't necessarily then have the individuals taking responsibility, and you wouldn't have individuals in a position for long enough for them to get their own natural feedback. But you're going to have a natural turnover, and some teams have much, depending on what you're doing, teams have different levels of turnover, and it's quite healthy. So you need to have systems that are set up and processes that are set up that whoever comes in will run, so that the information is still fed through. You still need people to check and make sure the information is relevant and things like that, but you need a structure that will genuinely give the right information through to middle management, to pass up to senior management, to pass up to the board, so that it gets interpreted up through the organization. I think you're going to have that turnover. The short-termism that we talk about is more about that short-term goal setting, looking at short-term shareholder value.
I see.
And focusing on that short-termism from a macro business perspective, actually saying, we just need to make 10% growth this year or 15% growth this year, and never mind how we do it. And that's what leads to unethical decisions being made about how do you generate that growth. And the growth becomes more important than the value to the customer.
Is that just executives trying to hit their bonuses, basically? And sort of, if I hit a growth target, then we all get paid more in the short run. And so I'm going to hit my growth bonuses, or
yes, exactly. Which is why there's all the legislation about how bonuses are paid in financial services, the clawback schemes that you've got. So you may get a £10 million bonus, but it can be clawed back over 5 years, or it gets paid in shares, so that you get that long-term buy-in to the company. So you're supposed to now have execs who, even if they get paid a bonus, it can be, if something goes wrong in 3 years' time, that bonus can be withdrawn. They have to pay it back. So there's an incentivization is a big part of the conduct culture.
One of the things that we've talked about in our class here in the United States and is also in the media here is the concern becomes particularly for publicly traded companies, not so much private. And I know in our book, we talk a little bit of Arup and Costco as examples of well-run companies. But for publicly traded companies on stock exchanges, oftentimes they're sort of gauged, their corporate health, at least for shareholders' perspective, is gauged by earnings per share. That is, how am I doing in terms of I own 20 shares of stock. What sort of return am I getting on my stock, and how much earnings are you making as a company as a result of that? And the problem with that has become the financialization of that formula, where companies really are either trying to do buybacks of stock to try to drive that number up, or something else to jimmy with that formula so that those look healthy, when in fact it might not be the development of business that's actually driving that. How do you instill long-termerism, if we want to use that word, and not short-termerism in publicly traded companies, where I just heard the statistic that the average shareholder holds a stock for 60 days now in the United States. That's it. And so it's not even a quarterly turnover of stock, and I've got to hit my quarterly targets with shareholders who are not even holding it for the entire quarter. It seems to me that I'm stuck as an executive, that the market is giving me certain incentives to hit, and yet exactly what Matt Whaley is saying is the truth, that if I want a sustainable corporate culture, I've got to try to move away from the attitude that it's all about earnings per share.
Yeah. So I remember which order they came in now. The Walker report was about 2011, and that was about the corporate governance issues and how boardrooms should be structured and set the right tone from the top. And the K review was about short-termism in equity markets, and it is about equity markets rather than privately held companies. It's probably too big a debate to get into about the state of the world economy and its dependence on equity markets and financial services and trading, and it's probably too big. I mean, you made me read Wendell Holmes and the Commonwealth market, so I'm all into like farmer economics and stuff like that now. But I can't.
I don't want to get too philosophical. I mean, you're right, and maybe in a future lecture we can have a sort of a world panning of the world to see what's going on. But
I just think if shareholders only hold shares for 60 days, they're not really invested in the company. So I think that's less important than the people who run the company and make decisions for that body corporate. Yeah, if they only think 60 days ahead, then that company is going to be in trouble. If they only think 12 months ahead, that company is going to at some point be in trouble, because they're always reacting to the market and reacting to what other people are doing. The longer, more strategic view you can take as an organization, the more successful you're going to be in the longer term. And that's really the drive of good corporate governance. It's the drive of Arup that we use an example in the book, where they want to deliver value to almost to the world. They want to deliver value through their services. They understand that they have to make money and be economically viable, but they also want to deliver excellent customer projects, and they want their people to be able to do interesting work. And there's a tension between those three things that needs to be managed, because you can't focus excessively on economic viability, because then the quality of the customers that you take on and the work you deliver will potentially suffer at the expense of the economics. But equally, if you focus entirely on doing interesting work, your economics could fall apart, and then you don't have a company anymore. Too much on customer satisfaction and value, then again economics can fail, and you can start to again lose that thread of interesting work. So you need to keep, the point of that section of the book is really about keeping a balance and accepting that you're going to have big strategic objectives that are going to, or fundamental objectives for your company that are going to pull you in different directions if you follow one exclusively. And you have to take a bigger view. So, okay, we need to manage all three and try and keep a level of balance about them.
Yeah, and I don't know how much you know about Arup, but do you know anything about how they've actually achieved that? How did they instill those values and reach that balance? How does a company that's been out of balance come into balance?
So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know whether we're out of balance, but I know that there was a founding speech. The Ove Arup was and the leadership were concerned that the company that they'd set up would continue in the direction that they'd set it. So they wanted to set corporate values that people could still, that employees could still work by, and that value statement is front and center on the website. It's communicated to all employees when they join, and it's something that is part of a culture that's inculcated within the company. It's that communication and getting people to buy into it. And it sort of threads through everything that they do. I mean, you probably know the Costco example better than I do.
Well, and Costco does some of that, because I think that, when you go there, they have sort of their 6-point formula or whatever we've laid out in our book of how they treat their various stakeholders in there. And I think it is that balance that you talk about, that each of them to some extent has to be weighed and sort of balanced against the other. How you treat your customers, how you treat your vendors, how you treat your employees, all matter ultimately to your profit line, as does your focus on the economics. And so in looking at this, I think you're right that you have to capture all those different aspects, bring it together, and synergize that somehow to make that formula work. My question is, you and I talk a little bit about this, and I know your work at EY, you talk about key performance indicators that you actually use to some extent in this process to come in and look at how companies are doing in these regards. Do you want to talk a little bit about
that? Yeah. So, I mean, it's a way of framing the problem that you're trying to solve for clients, basically. So, I mean, I suppose at one level, the governance side of things, the value statement is probably relatively straightforward to get a skeleton value statement together, but actually getting that to reflect the values of your company, you want to involve people from your company and actually, all levels of your company, and actually helping to develop those value statements so they feel like they've been a part of that, and so they actually reflect where your company is at a point in time. We've got all sorts of tools and frameworks and accelerators to help companies to go through that process, to work out where they are on a scale of maturity compared to peer organizations.
How long does that take for a company if they want to get started on that and they're lacking a good value statement and they want to plan for it? How much time do they need to set aside, and how much effort on their employees' part?
Do you know what? It's probably not my area of expertise. On a legal risk side, I could tell you. On a general, corporate governance, corporate value, we've got people that are so much more qualified at that than me. That if they saw this and they thought I was saying it only takes 6 weeks.
We'll bring them in on a
Matt, what the hell are you doing? Get off the video call. So yeah, no, I mean,
we'll bring one of them in on a future show. We got plenty of these.
No, but the key is to understand what you're trying to achieve at the end. So you're not, when you create a value statement, you're not trying to just achieve having a value statement. You're trying to achieve a cultural change within your organization so that people's behavior reflects those values. And that implementation side is really difficult to get right. And we put KPIs together, and we have key risk indicators for legal risk, and they help to reflect what's happening. Because what I found the most interesting bit of that chapter to write was the bit about policy and practice, where we worked with Graham Copnall at University of East London, who's from he's a health sector specialist, and he was talking about health policy and how, and he gets really philosophical, but talking about structuration. So where you have structure at the top that leads to action at the bottom, and it's kind of a new philosophical regime that combines modernity with post-modernity, and you end up in post-modernity, or wherever we are now, where you've gone from having a big ideal to just pure individual focus, and now we're somewhere in the middle, realizing that if you just let people do what they want, that's not going to lead to the goal that you're trying to set to them. But if you just set people a goal, people are quite likely just to do what they want. So you need to be able to monitor and check and guide and influence people down a path that you want them to follow.
And the key performance indicator helps with that?
Yeah, because it gives you feedback. as to what people are doing. So if you know that you want to go from A to B, and you identify certain things that are going to help you, you can set up metrics and monitor them and see how people are, see how your organization is doing. If you don't do that, you've got no feedback loop. And getting that policy to work in practice is all about the feedback loop and checking that the actions that people are taking, which are always going to be interpretive. So your value statement is written down as policy. That policy is interpreted by people into working practices, which then sort of informs your culture. And it's, you need performance indicators to check how that interpretation is being done and whether the outcome of that interpretation reflects and is aligned to your original values that you're trying to put in place.
Okay, that's great. Maybe we could talk a little bit now about the boardroom basics, because we talk about that, about making up the members of the board and getting that sort of constellation of proper board members right is sort of key, you say, to the process. If you don't get that board fit correct, then from top down, there's going to be structural fragility in the company.
Yeah.
How do you do that? How do you know in advance, especially if I haven't necessarily measured and I haven't brought in Matt Whaley yet to do my risk checks and find out how healthy we are? How do I start that process and get that good board picked out?
So you need a couple of things. You need to have the right blend of skills on the board and the right blend of personalities that are willing to challenge each other and to take each other on in discussions. You need to have a good balance of executives and non-executives. So non-executives would take on the responsibility for matters of governance, whereas executives would be commercial, keeping the business running, making the returns. Need to have a healthy relationship between your chair and your CEO if they're separate, and they're not always separate. And you need to have a good company secretarial team. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out was a bit about the more strategic role of the company secretariat in helping to keep the board running efficiently, to helping to create or help the chair, and it's a balance between what they're responsible for and what they just help to facilitate, but helping to create that culture of challenge, and also helping to act as a bridge between the board and senior management, so that they can help to streamline the information that goes to the board and help the people in senior management to understand what level of information the board want and what they want to know about, so they can make their decisions.
So back up for a minute, because in the United States, we're not as familiar with company secretaries. It's not a common term of parlance that you now have in Britain. Could you explain a little of how this role came to be and what exactly the functions of it are? Because we're not that familiar with company secretaries here.
All right, so essentially they're kind of like the civil service of the corporate world. They're the people that set agendas, that make sure that companies are being run according to corporate governance rules, so that they have the right committees, that the legal entities are, each legal entity has the relevant governance structure. They take the minutes of the meetings, they manage the information flow, so they will liaise between the CEO or the chair and other committees to make sure that information flows from one committee to another. So they help to oil the governance mechanism within organizations. I would be really surprised if you didn't have an equivalent function in the US.
I think we have something called compliance, which is basically similar to what you're talking about, looking at sort of regulatory expectations, external issues, and bringing that in.
I bet that's different. I bet you there's some sort of corporate secretariat function in the US. There must be.
I'll look it up and get it back to you on it for next week. It's not coming to mind what it would be.
You need to do some revision.
Yeah. So in that role, you say that in the book, when we talk about this, that it's good to have some conflict on the board and among the members of the company secretariat and so forth. How much is healthy? I mean, we obviously don't want open warfare here, but President Obama, during his administration, said one of his favorite books was called Team of Rivals, which is by about Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet during the Civil War, and how Lincoln brought in sort of mortal enemies with each other to sort of get that sounding board of ideas and bring in people who ordinarily wouldn't be seen in a room together. Do we want that level of sort of vicious conflict there, or is there a balance? How do we strike that balance?
It needs to be healthy conflict, I think. You have to have healthy conflict. You have to have people that are willing to challenge the executive. So that's an important part of the role of the non-executive directors. So they're people that will come in for purely for board meetings to chair certain subcommittees of the board, but will possibly sit on 3 or 4 boards as independent directors. So they get a bigger view of the market, and they're there to challenge the executive to make sure that there is that healthy level of challenge. Now, if they're not performing that role, and everybody is just following the strongest, most vocal member of the executive team, then you end up with groupthink. You end up with a lack of challenge. People, you don't think through the risks of what you might be doing, and you can end up in the due diligence light world that we had over here, and you can just end up doing the wrong thing because you're not willing to question whether the decisions are the right ones.
But isn't it always hard if I'm working for a corporation, no matter how strong my character or how outspoken I may be in general practice, if my bread is getting buttered by the corporation and they're the ones paying me and my job's on the line if I say the wrong thing to the wrong person, there's a bit of a conflict of interest in that sense of if I'm being brought in to speak my mind and challenge people, and yet those very people I challenge might be able to terminate my employment, then isn't there a bit of a pushback that we got to solve the money problem, so to speak, or a different stream of revenue that pays for me, or the people I challenge aren't necessarily the people who can fire me?
Again, to be honest, I'm not sure how fireable a non-executive director is.
Okay.
I don't know. You would probably take them on a fixed term, so 2 or 3 years. And you're bringing them in because of their expertise in specific areas. So they might have an expertise in risk, they might have an expertise in finance or tax or whatever skill gap you think you have on the board. You would get an INED or an independent non-executive director or a non-executive director to fill that. And you're asking them to do a job. If you ask them to come in and do a job, but actually all you mean is do what I say, then that's not a healthy board.
Right. So one way around that might be to offer a fixed term contract to them that no matter what you do, short of sort of malfeasance of trying to, to sabotage the company or steal money or something, that you're not going to be terminated for your freedom of speech, so to say.
Yeah. I don't know how much. I think it would be a really unhealthy place if our companies hired people to give them independent views and challenge, and then fired them for giving independent views and challenge.
But that's the Enron case in the United States. That's precisely what happened: is a lack of board oversight and sort of yes men, if you want to call them that, saying whatever you want goes, and blind board that led to Sarbanes-Oxley and a lot of regulation here.
So, I mean, what's the effect of Sarbanes-Oxley and that regulation at board level, though? Presumably that has an effect on how boards are run, information that flows through, their ability to fire independent directors. Presumably we've got the senior managers regime here in financial services. We've got corporate governance rules. That's being... it's the fact that things like Enron have happened that have instigated the legislative changes, regulatory changes, and the focus on boards.
Sure, and that's exactly right, that after Enron, you had to have independent directors come on, and so there was an entire regulatory regime that came in to try to stand up a process by which directors were not simply beholden friends or golf course buddies, with the CEO or chairman, but rather true independent professionals who would come in and offer sort of impartial and effective advice.
Yeah, so that's the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we've gone I don't know whether it's a step further here, but we've got the senior managers regime now to make senior managers, you know, not just at board level, actually a level below that as well, directly responsible and accountable for actions that the corporation takes, to try and embed that same level of accountability further through the organization.
Mm-hmm. You talk in the book about the role of the senior independent director and how important a role that is alongside the company secretary. A lot of pressure and liability riding on those shoulders, right? Are we going to run into short supplies of these people who actually want to step up for those positions, and potentially when the ship starts sinking, they know that a lot is riding on their shoulders, isn't it?
So there was a real danger of that here when the senior managers regime was first mooted. So that's that piece of regulation that we talked about a few times now that sets that level of accountability. And there was going to be an additional burden of accountability given to independent directors as well as the executive, which would have made it, you would be a fool to want to be an independent director had the regime been implemented as it was first proposed, because you can't, in all honesty, work 30 days for an organization and say that you have full oversight and be fully accountable for everything that happens. You're there to perform a different role. You're there to perform that role of challenge, expert insight, but the executive body are the people that have to implement.
Mm-hmm. So that was
if that had gone through, I don't think you would have had any independent directors. As it is, I think it's an interesting role for people who have been experienced in industry and want to continue to contribute.
Sure, that makes good sense. Let's turn.
I think they make quite a bit of money as well, mate. So
I think that's true. But money's only good until the ship starts sinking, and then
yeah.
No risk, no reward, so to speak. And there's a lot of potential risk there when you're at the top of that pyramid.
Yeah.
Turning to that, Matt, I want to turn to the pyramid structure and what we've talked about with the echo and the feedback and so forth, and measuring those impacts of corporate governance. We've talked about this a little bit now, but in the book, we talk about how there's three sort of overlapping circles, that policy is not a linear process. Mm-hmm. That's driven top down, but that there's concentric circles of feedback. What are those concentric circles, and how should we be familiar with them? I know we've talked about in the book, but maybe we could talk a little more here.
So you've got value statements,
right?
You've got policy,
right?
And you've got working practice. And they are concentric circles because they feed back on each other. So you set your value statement, and that starts as a big circle, and then that's interpreted into policy. So we want to be an ethical oil digger. So that's a value statement. You want to be ethical, so you need to interpret what ethical means, and then what does that mean if you are mining in Western Africa, and how do you interpret that requirement, that policy level requirement to be an ethical digger, and what does that get turned into as a policy? So you have a raft of policies that you write, all reflecting that value statement, and then they start to circle back. So you can check whether the policies that are being drafted actually, whether in your opinion as the person who sets that value statement, whether they're reflecting it. And then you have a group of people that take a policy and turn that into working practice and action. And again, you will create procedures, you will create ways of doing things, you will start to create culture from the bottom, as much as the value starts to create culture from the top, and the policy is doing that in the middle, and they all start to circle around, and there's a feedback. And the bit that gets missed, as we've said a few times, is that feedback from, how well does your working procedure reflect your policy? Mm-hmm. And I've spoken to contacts, colleagues, associates through the book where they've said, actually, we have a team that analyzes working procedures to see whether they're reflective of the policy, which is I thought that was quite out there, because you don't hear about many teams like that in existence, like a
Yeah.
whole unit in Middle England's doing that, or the Midlands. So it is just an interesting way of looking at it as a live system, as a living system, because the problem that Graham was talking about with the health services thing is that there used to be this culture of just setting a policy at the top and assuming it would be implemented as you would expect it to be, and then 3 years later wondering why you weren't getting the cost savings that you were expecting, or that you weren't getting the business change that you were expecting, or the revenue that you wanted to bring in.
Right.
And that's because people were interpreting policies and putting them into action in ways that were unexpected. And unless you check and manage that as a process, actually, you're always going to lose sight of it. And human beings do things in an infinite number of ways for infinite reasons. So you need to keep a check and to make sure that actually what's happening is reflective of what you're expecting to happen. So the
Do I
management,
have to wait?
overall management responsibility.
Do I have to wait until we actually don't meet our revenue target to know it's not working? Or can we, the point of what you do, for a large part of what you do, is being sort of prophylactic or preventative, and not waiting until the ship is sunk to then say your ship's sunk, but rather to step in, and if the feedback loop that we're talking about in these concentric circles are not working, that we restore them earlier than later. How do I know that I'm failing? And how early can I know in the process, once I've set my value statement, I've set my policy, I'm ready to go, and we've got a brand new sort of set of issues, and we've come up with our perfect Be Ethical line. How soon can I find out this is not working? And
so, I mean, first of all, it's absolutely too late. Once you don't make, if you wait 2 years, you don't make your revenue savings, you don't make your costs, meet your cost targets. Sorry, you don't make your revenue and you don't hit your cost targets, then that's too late. And that's the thing about that constant checking and setting up those performance measures and saying, okay, we're expecting to be, I don't know if you can see my hands waving around, they're all over the place. So you're expecting to be here, but there are a certain number of steps that you don't get there by magic. You get there through a process, and it's not entirely predictable because you're going to weave around, but actually there are some stages you can check, and they're always dependent on what you're trying to achieve in your organization, the data sets that you have, the data that you generate. But you can just pick steps along the way and say, okay, if we don't meet our cost reduction targets, if you want to save $1 billion and you don't, and that over 3 years, you need to save 330. Well, let's say you're going to save 200 in the first year, 400 in the second, and 400 in the third. If you only save 50 in the first year, you need to check. It's just an easy measure, but you can go back and say, well, if we want to save 200 in the first year, what does that look like over a month? What behaviors do we need to be instigating? What projects should be running? How is everything working? Just set those up over a period of time, so you've got constant monitoring and feedback. The trick, I suppose, is to make sure that you don't create an army of people that are so big that you're never going to make a cost saving. It doesn't matter how much revenue you generate, because you're spending so much money on people just checking to see whether you're moving to plan, and everything just getting, the message is getting lost because you've got an army of hundreds or thousands of people just trying to check whether things are working and invent KPIs and all that
so
stuff.
there's a risk of over measuring too, that you can take you take the temperature of the patient too many times.
Yeah, and there's a risk of doing too much, and trying to measure too many things without checking and constantly checking whether they mean something, and just measuring things because you can measure them rather than because they match a plan. And that's, I suppose, if you're talking about what we do at EY, is we help people to, we can help people to measure, but the value is helping people to work out what to measure, and what the important things are and what the roadmap looks like, so that you can implement big programs of work as efficiently as possible with the best possible chance of a good result.
So give us, we've done a nice sort of overview, I think, of the three parts of Chapter 2 dealing with this. Give me a summary. If I'm a corporate executive and I'm hearing this from you for the first time, and we've sort of had some problems on board, or, we're not meeting our earnings targets, our employees have morale problems, there's been some rapid turnover, and we seem a little listless in development. And I come to you, and I've read Chapter 2 of the book, and I've studied it in great detail, and now I come to you and say, okay, where do I start? What do I do first, and what order or what sequence should I go in, and who should I bring in as outsiders, as consultants, and what should I do on the inside, and how do I do this?
Okay.
I know it's a big question.
Just as a quick 2-minute summary to the chapter. Right, so let's assume that they want to run their business within the remit of law and regulation. So we've got an honest group of executives that want to do the right thing. But for some reason, they're not doing that. There are lots of reasons. You need lots of different specialists depending on what the reason is, but you need to have a strategy, of course, and there are lots of business strategy consultants out there. You need to have a value statement or a statement about how you're going to achieve that strategy, and then you need to have a good set of tools to help you to implement that strategy. And I think most companies will fall down on the implementation if they're going to fall down anywhere. I think setting strategic visions is taught at management school all over the world, and there are any number of people that can give you a strategic vision. Giving you a strategic vision that will help you to implement an objective is probably a different thing, or helping to implement that vision is difficult, especially when you run large and complex organizations. And the risks that bubble up from the surface of large and complex organizations are often systemic risks, in that they are the aggregate of lots of small risks that happen. So lots of individuals doing something slightly wrong that adds up to something very wrong because you've lost sight of the actions that people within your company are taking, and you're responsible for those actions. So you need to have a good set of metrics, or a good set of measures that help you to identify what people are doing, why they're doing it, and how that affects your strategy. And there's a whole framework of policies, of procedures, of data analytics you can put in place to manage that. But the simple thing is to make sure that your strategy and your value statement is interpreted in the way that you want, and you have to have a way that you want it to be interpreted. If you're going to drive a strategy forward, you can't just set a strategy and then leave it. So that your policies reflect your value, reflect what you're trying to achieve, and that the way people are implementing those, and you don't need to, this isn't like a command and control thing necessarily, because there has to be room for variation. But that you set boundaries for the way that people work. You set clear boundaries around, from our perspective, around compliance with law and regulation, around how do you contract with third parties, around managing disputes when you get into them with customers. And there are behavioral aspects to all of those things that you want to try and manage through your policy. So I suppose as an exec, you want to know that the actions that your employees are taking aren't going to lead to some unwanted accountability for you as a senior executive for corporate liability or individual liability for the mistakes that might get made. So you just, I don't know if that answers your question. Actually, I feel a bit rambly.
It certainly does. How much boundary setting should there be? You say I don't want a command and control structure because it's sort of it stifles creativity, it stifles innovation, the ability of people to think freely and make the right decision where they're in a situation to do so. But that we have to set these boundaries. That's a tricky balance to reach, isn't it? Setting that the dark and the light and saying this is the darkness and you shouldn't fall off into this because you're going to get us into trouble.
Yeah. So again, if we just look at it from a legal risks perspective rather than the bigger macro business piece, you set those boundaries through your appetite statement and your definition, right? So you have an appetite statement that says you have zero zero appetite for willful or reckless indifference to law and regulation. Because you just, as an organization that wants to operate within the bounds of the law, you cannot tolerate people that will willfully break the law, even if it's for the sake of seeking profit for your company. That's a line, and it's a clear line, and it's easy to identify and to know where you've gone across that. What's more difficult is inadvertent breach of law and regulation, or areas where law can be applied differently in different circumstances. So, an unexpected application of the law. There are variances that result in lots of other levels of risk bubbling up. So you can deal with your absolute "we don't go there" line, but you have to accept that, particularly if you're a big, complex, cross-jurisdictional organization where you have a large volume and complexity of law and regulation to comply with, a large volume and complexity of ways in which law and regulation is applied in different jurisdictions or by different regulatory bodies, because you'll undoubtedly be regulated by more than one. There's a lot of room for things to go wrong. Not deliberately wrong, but that's where risks happen, and your ability to manage those risks and to make sure it's just small things that bubble up. That's where the framework and where the legal risk management structure comes in and becomes really important. So you can set boundaries, and it's not that difficult to set a hard boundary that says you don't go outside of this. But within that, you accept that risks can happen, mistakes can be made. You're happy for mistakes to be made, because that means that people are having ideas and generating business and trying to do things that are new and interesting and exciting and innovate and do all of the cool things that make businesses successful and sustainable. And then you give people structures, risk management frameworks and structures to help to minimize or help them to understand where they're likely to cause serious breaches, by helping them to identify, quantify the risks as they go along.
That's great. I think we're just about out of time for today. Is there anything that we haven't covered from Chapter 2 that comes to mind that you want to mention at the end?
I don't think so. No, I think we've done the boardroom. There's way more about the structure and the roles in the boardroom than we covered today in the book. We've done a couple of examples, mentioned Arup and Costco. Again, there's a lot more detail on those in Chapter 2 than we've managed to cover here. The important bit, I think, is that turning the policy in practice and how that works and how you can measure that. And that's a really interesting application area for people who are interested in legal risk or any sort of risk management. That's the bit where risk management really comes into its own, is helping to interpret where that policy statement is being interpreted into action, and whether the two are reflective of each other.
Great. Matt, thanks again for your time for section 2 here of the book. I look forward to seeing you in a future session with us on this.
Cool. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.